In this episode, we're going to discuss the water requirements of brewing using the Grainfather system, which may differ depending on what type of brewing system you are currently working with. If you're using a false bottom, you may have experienced gluten-free malt passing through the false bottom, which is why in our previous episode we discussed a modification for that. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you're holding that grain back with the false bottom, or in this case the bottom plate of the grain inner basket, there's a gap of water between the lower plate and the bottom of the boil body of the Grainfather unit. There's also a gap around the inner basket and the boil body of the Grainfather as well. While we didn't measure the volume of water that the gap between the inner basket and the boil body consists of, that would be quite difficult depending on the grain bed or grain bill that we're using. We did measure the volume of water between the bottom of the boil body and the bottom plate of the inner basket. The main body of the Grainfather, which is called the boiler body, requires 2 inches of fluid to reach the bottom of the lower plate of the inner basket or mash tun. As you can see, this volume also covers the filter and the temperature probe. There's also a gap of approximately 9/16 of an inch between the boiler body and the inner basket. When we measured the total volume of fluid in the bottom 2 inches of the Grainfather, it was about 115 ounces of fluid. Now that we're aware of the volume of water that sits at the bottom of the Grainfather before it hits the bottom plate of the inner basket, you may be asking yourself, how does this affect your brewing in the Grainfather? And it may not. We just want you to be aware of the information because we want to ensure that since the Grainfather recirculates the wort, that there's enough liquid in your mash that you can allow it to properly recirculate. Many gluten-free home brewers have been running a thicker mash, and since we want to make sure that there's enough water in our mash to allow the Grainfather to recirculate, we might have to make some changes to our calculations. For example, if you would run a 15-pound grain bill using a ratio of 1 quart to 1 pound of malt, that would be 15 quarts of water. But considering that there's 3.6 quarts of water sitting under the bottom plate in your inner basket, to just compensate for that alone, you'd have to increase that ratio to 1.24 quarts of water to 1 pound of grain in that example to have the ratio that you want in the mash inner basket or the mash tun area of the Grainfather. Lastly, we're going to discuss a few very inexpensive and simple modifications to the Grainfather unit. These recommendations were made by David Heath, who has a YouTube page and a lot of videos about brewing with the Grainfather, although they are using conventional malts. And he, after brewing 100 batches of beer in the Grainfather, he made the following 2 recommendations. The first is for the upper plate. He recommends getting a stainless steel mesh screen that you would normally put in your sink drain and placing it on top of the upper plate. that is during the mash and during the sparge as well, and it prevents any grain from going down the center tube of the Grainfather. The other recommendation he made was to the filter itself, and his recommendation was to install 2 stainless steel clamps, one so that this rubber stop doesn't pop off and allow all hops or malt or whatever to pass through the pump, and then secondly, this clamp that actually holds the filter to the body so that doesn't somehow become detached. His primary concern was during the whirlpool that you may accidentally hit the filter, or just the force of the whirlpool itself, particularly if you're using something modified to an electric drill. The force alone may pop one or both of those off, and that was just a precaution to prevent that from happening. Alright, thank you for watching this episode. We're getting closer to our episode of actually brewing with the Grainfather, which we have planned for a couple days from now. Again, I'm Brian with glutenfreehomebrewing.com, and thank you for watching.